start you guys off with a little bit of good news. And the good news is, after almost a 4-year hiatus, you can see that our real GDP is essentially getting back to pre-recession levels. And though that's not essentially where we want it right now, and the growth in 2011 isn't quite as substantial as it was in 2010, the revised estimates on the second quarter of growth at 1.3% and the estimates of 2.5% growth in the third quarter show that the economy is indeed growing. And this is reflected in the 9 quarters of positive growth we've had since the end of the recession around June of 2009. And other than government expenditures, the other contributions to economic growth are indeed contributing to it positively. And what this graph does is it essentially kind of takes the percentage of the economic growth as a percent and shows the distribution of how it contributes to that 2.5% increase itself. And the reason government expenditures aren't adding positively or negatively to the equation is simply because an increase in federal spending has been offset by state and local budget cuts. And as a whole, consumption in the last quarter added to about 68.8% of economic growth. And as a whole, consumption has been rising, as you can see from the second to third quarter. This is reflected in the retail sales, which shows that consumers are essentially coming back to a spending mood. But one worrisome observation we did find is that even as consumption continues to rise, real disposable income is falling. And this is reflected in the decrease in the savings rate from 4.1% to 3.6%. And logic will tell you that you can't continue spending out of your savings forever, and what this essentially may lead to at some point is people leveraging back up. And on a more positive note, investment, which I would argue is the biggest contributor to an economic recovery, or the driving force behind an economic recovery, has been on an established upward trend for quite some time. And we believe that this will continue simply because all these corporations, due to the uncertain markets, are sitting on huge profits and large amounts of cash that they're just unwilling to put into the market right now. And manufacturing as a whole may not be the biggest contributor to GDP. It roughly sits around 12%. But as you can see here, it's staying above the expansionary baseline of 50 basis points on the PMI graph, and it's rising for the first time since June, so that's great. And though the economy is recovering, it's growing at one of the slowest rates we have on record. And the biggest contributing reasons to that mainly comes from political instability and Washington volatility, which has led to a downgrade in the U.S. credit rating in uncertain markets. International economic anxieties mainly coming from a slightly decreasing China and the European debt crisis, and overall low consumer confidence. And a lot of people due to this are getting a little impatient about the slow growth rate. But the question is, do we really need to be so impatient about it? Because we ran some simple calculations taking averages over the past couple of recessions, and what we've seen is that though this economic recession isn't growing at the incredibly rapid rates of the recessions of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it does show a very similar trend to the recessions of 1991 and 2001. And so then the question itself becomes, were these recessions just victims of a very similar circumstance, or are we seeing a new pattern of slower, long extended anemic growth? And this question I'll leave you on, and I would like to pass this to Dennis out. Thank you, Wes.
The latest payroll survey in September shows that we've created 103,000 new jobs. 137 were created in the private sector, and the public sector decreased by roughly 30,000 jobs. While job creation is far below what is needed to make a dent in the joblessness, the September payroll numbers were better than expected, and the upward revisions on previous months brought a sigh of relief for the capital markets and bolstered consumer and business confidence. Total employment is definitely on an upward trend, but it's slow, so we must be patient. The new employment numbers for October won't be out until Friday, but the latest jobless claims indicate that there will be little change in the employment situation. Like I said before, jobs are being created, but not enough to reduce the unemployment rate, which is hovered around 9.1%. In September, the labor force increased by 400,000. Two possible reasons for this stagnant unemployment rate are that the population is growing, but more importantly, workers are starting to return to the labor force. The last time the unemployment rate was this high, in 1982 to 83, it took 6 full years until 1989 for the unemployment rate to return to its natural level of 5.5%. Less than 2 years ago, Paul Krugman voiced his opinion that we were worried about a serious deflationary spiral, much like Japan in the 1990s, although in 2011 we haven't seen any deflation indications. So it's time to start thinking about inflation, as we can see by the CPI. The CPI with food and energy increased by 3.9% over the last year, and without food and energy rose by 2%. So even though prices have not had huge increases, there's a definite risk for creeping inflation. Paul Volcker continues to speak out on the risk of inflation that's higher than expected, and inflation that continues to be 1 to 2% higher than the Fed's expected 2% inflationary goal can quickly become a problem as it weakens the purchasing power of the lower 70% of wage earners who have not seen their average wages grow at the same rate as inflation over the last 40 years. This tendency is confirmed by the GDP report, but at least for now, it looks like inflation is not accelerating. Inflation has been tame in recent past, but the problem, however, is that there are 3 major indications that prices will start accelerating. The first, the PPI for finished goods has risen 6.9% over the last 12 months. Commodity prices, although have recently dipped, have a rising trend, and also oil prices are expected to rise above $100 through 2012, and inflationary expectations are up. Scott Withers.
The first thing we say about the financial markets is the catastrophe that was threatening the financial system in 2008 has been avoided. After the Lehman Brothers collapse, TARP and other programs have prevented contagion and systemic collapse. As you can see here, banks have been recapitalized by these programs, and delinquency rates on all types of loans, including consumer credit cards and business loans, have fallen, which is a very good sign for long-term growth. Banks are, here you can see that banks are making money again. Granted, we are not at pre-bubble levels, but nonetheless revenue is growing. And here you can see that banks are starting to lend again, which is a very good sign. And with the big rally last month, the stock market has nearly recovered all their loss in 2008. Yes, we do realize that the last 2 days it has fallen a bit. This supports our claim that the stock market is extremely volatile. However, one large worry still remains: the housing market, where correction is still going on. Although it does appear that prices have returned to pre-bubble levels as represented by this graph. Here we present to you the St. Louis Financial Stress Index, which tries to quantify the stress in the financial markets by using 18 different variables, including interest rates, yield spreads, and volatility. It does appear that we have returned to a reasonable level, although not quite as low as before the recession. Finally, I present to you the record amount of reserves and the ever-growing money supply, thanks to the Fed's rescue activities. The excess reserve graph is especially frightening. It is our belief that the Fed should stop paying interest on these reserves. However, that is not what created the